The Church always seems to have been battling against itself and against the world, and it's no different for the period we are looking at today. The Reformation Church had been born in an age of superstition and ignorance, but that was soon to change, and mostly because of the arrival of the printing press. Education and thinking no longer became the preserve of a few, but a more popular pastime. With the differences of opinion over religious matters between Catholicism and Protestantism, theology and learning began to separate.
The first and most important figure in this movement was René Descartes. He is often called the father of modern philosophy. He was a scientist, philosopher, mathematician and writer, all rolled into one. He is often seen as the first figure in the period known as the Age of Reason, or sometimes the Enlightenment. This was not really a movement as such, more a change in the way people thought. Science became as important as religion, for example. Importantly, the shift of thinking moved from God at the centre to man at the centre. Descartes himself remained a Roman Catholic to his death in 1650, though his books were later banned by the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, he started a way of thinking that still shapes much of the way we think today. John Locke took this idea further. Locke is called an empiricist. All knowledge, he said, is obtained through the senses, what we can see, hear, touch and smell. He didn't write off faith, but said that knowledge gained through faith is secondary at best to what can be gained through what we observe.
Not surprisingly, subsequent thinkers took steps further away from God. The effects on the Church were startling. Many of the claims of the Bible could not be rationalized in this way, and rather than being accepted by faith, they were rejected by the thinking people of the day. But these thinkers did not become atheists overnight. Rather, they still maintained a very Christian worldview, but their Christianity was not the Christianity of the Puritans, or Calvin, or the Westminster Standards. Rather, they veered towards a rational view, which later became called deism. In deism, God exists, all right, but he is an impartial observer on the world. He's set the world going, like winding up a clock and letting it run its course. Not surprisingly, the effect on the Church was very deep. The Church became dry, dusty, and eventually almost dead. The changes imposed by the Crown meant that the practices of the Church did not match the teaching, and frankly, the best men had all been turned out anyway. So at the turn of the 18th century then, the Church was in real trouble. It was only kept alive by the tradition of church attendance. Something radical was needed, something radical to shake the Church out of its lethargy. And something radical came in the form of two particular men, John Wesley and George Whitefield. Both attended Oxford University, where they belonged to a group of students who met to study the Bible and do good works for the poor and underprivileged. They had, however, very different stories.
Wesley was raised in a Church of England rectory. His mother had been an independent church member before she married Wesley's father. He was converted probably in 1725 after reading William Law's Christian Perfection and the Serious Call, though his conversion is sometimes dated much later. The Holy Club he subsequently formed at Oxford with his brother Charles was called, rather rudely by others, the Methodists, because of their methodical habits. He began to speak and preach about his convictions, but, and this was a sign of the times, churches were closed to him. They didn't like his message from the Bible, which called people to repentance and to be born again. Wesley, however, found that he did not need churches to preach in. He turned first to graveyards, then to the fields and towns. Barred from his father's church, he upset some of the more traditional parishioners by climbing onto a tombstone to deliver his sermon. By the time he died, he had 135,000 followers and over 530 preachers who shared his convictions. Methodism was born, though it was not a separate denomination from the Anglican Church until after his death. Wesley covered enormous distances on horseback, bringing the good news of Jesus to all kinds of people. His contemporary George Whitefield was a close friend. Whitefield had come up to Oxford from a rather different background. His mother, a widow, was an innkeeper in Gloucester. Whitefield also had a conversion experience reading a book, this time Henry Scougal's The Life of God in the Soul of Man. Like Wesley, he found churches closed to him, But this did not dampen his enthusiasm, and he would often preach to crowds of over 10,000 people in the open fields.
Both Wesley and Whitefield had a profound effect on the church. It's possible to argue that England had not really experienced a Reformation. The Protestant changes that had become part of the fabric of the country had always been imposed. They'd never come from popular conviction. This was why the continuing Catholic practices in church were staying so popular. But with the coming of this Great Awakening, as it's sometimes called, real Reformation came to these shores. Thousands and hundreds of thousands were converted. And the effect was felt further afield too. Both Wesley and Whitefield visited America and indirectly had a hand in events there.
One particular man stands out there. His name was Jonathan Edwards. He was a pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts, and in 1734 people began to respond to his sermons which called for a personal experience of conversion. The revival spread from there to many parts of the colonies. Many people were affected. The revival in America, though, was short-lived. Within 3 years it had begun to die out.
It and the preaching of Wesley and Whitefield were criticised for being too emotional. Remember, this is the Enlightenment, where being rational and logical were valued more highly than emotions. Edwards in particular faced this criticism, and he responded with one of the greatest Christian books ever written, a treatise concerning religious affections in 3 parts, he called it, more commonly known today as the Religious Affections. Certainly neither Wesley, Whitefield nor Edwards were embarrassed by emotion. Whilst none of them played upon it, they recognised that a true work of conversion could not possibly leave a Christian unaffected. Their preaching was often marked by an emotional breakdown of hundreds and sometimes thousands of listeners. Interestingly, Wesley and Whitefield had a sharp disagreement and did not work together for most of their preaching lives. Wesley was a follower of Jacob Arminius. He was called an Arminian. Whitefield was a Calvinist, and their correspondence is very revealing. Nevertheless, the disagreement did not break their friendship, and Whitefield asked Wesley to preach at his funeral before he died, which Wesley graciously did.